got some books in our podcast studio. Now, Ken and I read a lot, and so this is, I think, something, and we talk a lot about books, so I think this is relevant to be in our podcast studio. However, if you don't read, adding books to your podcast studio makes you look more educated and smarter. And so even if you're not a reader, books might be a good play. So consider it. And if you don't read at all, you might as well get leather books, because that makes you look the smartest.
Okay, so David is super creative, and he set up this whole podcast studio, the walls, like he put everything in here, and he gets everything set up perfect. And I'm like, what the hell am I going to add to this podcast studio? Like, David's done everything, right? And I'm thinking, and I'm at home, and if you're an Amazon seller, or if you're going to be an Amazon seller, I get all my returns shipped to my house, and sometimes, especially in Q4, I get wacky shit that shows up at my house. Like, Amazon just makes mistakes. They send the wrong products in, whatever. And last month, I got this badass watch shipped to my house, and I thought, what the hell? I thought, this is crazy. And it was sitting on my counter at home for a few weeks, and I thought, like, I'm not a super flashy guy. I wear a Fitbit, and I just thought, man, this is my addition to the podcast.
All right, so this, as you can see, is a Maker's Mark, and I went down to Louisville, Kentucky, and toured the Maker's Mark plant, and I'd heard of this thing called a slam dunk, where you get to dip your own bottle in the wax, and I had heard of someone slam dunking an entire bottle in. And so when it was my turn, I got to the front of the line, and I told the lady, hey, just want to let you know I'm going to slam dunk. And she said, no, don't slam dunk, you're going to burn your fingers. And I did it anyway. And you can see my thumbprints right here that just burned. This wax is hot. And but I did get a slam dunk, kind of. And so this is just a nice little knick-knack to have in the podcast studio.
So David has all of this, David puts everything together in the podcast studio, and I contributed the watch, and then I thought, I'm gonna up my game, and I'm gonna bring my most prized possession to the podcast studio. The leg lamp. If you're not familiar with the leg lamp, please stop what you're doing, go watch Christmas Story. The leg lamp is legend.
Another critical thing for the podcast studio, bonsai tree. Listen, this is the tree of the samurai. And it's a nice thing to have in the podcast studio. We've got two of them, one right here and then one over there. And listen, it's not easy. It takes some maintenance because they can't sit in this dark podcast studio all the time. So there's some upkeep on a bonsai tree, but it helps with Zen and aura and all that other stuff. So we got a 32-inch TCL TV. I really like having a TV in the studio. One, we can use it to put our logo up when we're shooting a podcast, but it's also nice when we're talking about certain websites to just pull it up really quick as a reference. And so this is a TCL TV. Now, I had always been familiar with like Sony and Samsung, and I'd never heard of TCL. My brother told me about them, and they seem to be about half the price. Like, this was right around $200, and it comes with, it connects the internet. It's got Netflix, Prime, ties into our HDMI. It's really cheap, and it serves its purpose. And so I like having this in a podcast studio, and after having it, I don't know, it would be hard to picture recording a podcast without it. Next item in the podcast studio, an autographed bat. And this is an interesting story. I have no idea whose name that is. And I have looked it up, and I still don't know who it is. I suspect it's a Cardinals player, but I don't know. So for any baseball fans out there, or maybe this isn't even maybe this is just some guy, but I had this laying around in the house, and I thought, what a great what a great thing to put in the podcast studio. And look, it has some cryptic HOF89. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I don't know what this is, but I knew it belonged in the podcast studio. Next is the old-time Victor type cash register / calculator. This thing was my grandpa's. When I became an accountant, my father gifted it to me. Incredibly appropriate. And just something that I had laying around the house and is a perfect thing to put in the podcast studio. It represents, how I've spent the last decade of my life is in this profession. Next knickknack in the podcast studio is these cutting boards. And the story behind these are these things on Facebook called ASMR videos. And it's people doing things that are visually pleasing. So like cutting cheese very symmetrically. It's weird. But I was watching one of these on my Facebook feed, and I saw someone build a 3D cutting board. And for whatever reason, that just triggered a giant interest to get into woodworking. And so I actually started a company that I made and sold these. And we should do an entire podcast episode on it, but it started off as fun, but it got to the point where I'd get home from work and I felt like I had to go out to the wood shop and make cutting boards to fulfill orders, and I was the bottleneck in that business, and I ended up shutting it down because I prefer to make 10 of these a year and give them away at weddings as gifts. And so anyway, that was a failed business of mine, but lessons learned, and here are some of the products that I've built. But again, I was at one point in time thought I was going to make my millions manufacturing my own 3D cutting boards, and as it turns out, these just take quite some time. All right, next essential to have in your podcast studio is a Himalayan salt rock lamp. Now listen, I used to think these things were bullshit. They have these positive ions in them. Now listen, I'm not a scientist, and I don't know what a positive ion is. However, when I have this turned on, I like the color of it, and it makes me happy, goddammit. But we have 2 Himalayan salt rock lamps, and for those of you who think that they're snake oil, you're wrong. Check them out. I mean, it brings a good energy into your office for 10 or 15 bucks. It's money well spent. All right, and as you can see, this is library number 2. Now, because this is a dual camera shot, Ken wants to have books behind him because it makes him look more credible. But I also want to look credible. And so we have 2 bookshelves. And if you're going to run 2 cameras, I suggest taking your library and splitting it in 2. All right, now if you've listened to our show, you know we have excellent audio quality. And that is not by mistake. We have designed this entire room to be the perfect podcast studio. And one thing that really helps with that is having everything boxed in. And so this originally was just an empty workout room in my basement. And I don't work out a whole lot, so it wasn't getting a ton of use. And so I had this beautiful carpet in my basement that we weren't using, and we hung this up as a sound barrier, and it reduces the echo. It really helps with the acoustics, and we've actually also got a lot of compliments from our podcast guests because it's just so stinking beautiful. Really a work of art here. But anyway, that's our podcast studio. The last thing I'll say is since we were filming, we added lighting. Up above, we have 2 48-inch shop lights. These were like 30 bucks on Amazon, and LED bright light, and it really, it lightens up this space. And in terms of filming, having good lighting just makes everything better. And so we'll link to everything in the show notes, but that's our podcast tour.